November 9th, 2006. The Hammerstein Ballroom in New York City was packed with 3,000 people who had no idea they were witnessing history. David Bowie stepped onto that stage wearing a simple black suit, his hair slicked back, looking every bit the elegant icon the world had come to worship over 4 decades. The set list was familiar, comfortable even, a greatest hits collection that spanned from Space Oddity to his newer material. But something was different that night. Something in the air felt final, though nobody could quite put their finger on it. The band members would later say they sensed it too, this strange electricity that ran through every note, every pause between songs. And then, during the final number, Bowie did something he had never done before in his entire career. He turned off his microphone, walked to each member of his band, and whispered something that would haunt them for the next decade. Before we dive deeper into what happened that mysterious night, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. We're uncovering the untold stories, the hidden moments, and the secrets that shaped the legend of David Bowie. Hit that subscribe button now, because what you're about to hear has never been fully revealed until today. To understand the weight of that November evening, you need to understand where Bowie was in his life. The reality tour had wrapped up in 2004 after that terrifying moment in Prague, when he collapsed on stage, the heart surgery that followed, the warnings from doctors that his performing days might be over. For 2 years, Bowie had been quiet, selective, appearing only for special occasions. This concert at the Hammerstein Ballroom was billed as a charity event, a one-off performance for a good cause. Nothing about the promotion suggested this would be anything other than a generous gesture from a rock legend who still had plenty of years ahead of him. The tickets sold out in minutes, but there was no fanfare, no media circus. It was almost deliberately low-key, which in retrospect feels impossibly significant. The band that night included many of his longtime collaborators: Gerry Leonard on guitar, a man who had toured with Bowie through the Heathen and Reality albums; Sterling Campbell on drums, whose relationship with Bowie stretched back to the Tin Machine days; Gail Ann Dorsey on bass and backing vocals, a musician Bowie trusted so completely that he often let her take the lead on certain songs. These weren't just hired guns. These were people who knew David Robert Jones, not just the constructed persona of David Bowie. They had shared tour buses, late-night conversations, the intimate moments that happen when you spend months on the road together. And that night, every single one of them felt something was off. Sterling Campbell later described the soundcheck as unusually emotional. Bowie kept stopping between songs, staring out at the empty venue, his mind clearly somewhere else. At one point, he asked the lighting crew to dim everything except a single spotlight. He stood in that cone of light for nearly 5 minutes, not saying a word, just breathing. Gerry Leonard approached him, asked if everything was all right. Bowie smiled that famous smile and said something cryptic. "I'm just trying to remember what this feels like." Remember what feels like? Being on stage, performing, being alive? Leonard didn't push for clarification, but the comment lodged itself in his memory like a splinter. When the doors opened and the crowd filed in, the energy shifted. Bowie transformed, the way he always did, into that superhuman version of himself that could command a room with a single gesture. The show started with a bang, the opening chords of Life on Mars ripping through the speakers, and for the first hour, everything seemed perfect. Bowie moved through his catalog with the ease of a man who had sung these songs 10,000 times, yet still found new meaning in every verse. The audience sang along, swayed, cheered at all the right moments. But those who were paying close attention, those who really knew Bowie's stage presence, noticed the small differences. He was making more eye contact than usual, holding gazes with individual audience members for uncomfortable lengths of time. During Heroes, he gripped the microphone stand so tightly his knuckles went white, and when he reached the climactic final chorus, his voice cracked in a way that felt less like a performance choice and more like genuine emotion breaking through. Between songs, he spoke more than he typically did, thanking the crowd with an intensity that bordered on desperate. "You have given me everything," he said at one point, his voice thick. "Every single one of you. More than you could possibly know." The audience cheered, thinking it was just Bowie being gracious, but the band members exchanged glances. This wasn't normal. Gail Ann Dorsey, standing just a few feet away from him, could see his hands trembling between songs. She had seen Bowie perform sick, exhausted, dealing with the aftermath of his emergency surgery in Germany. But this was different. This wasn't physical weakness. This was something deeper, something existential. During Under Pressure, the song he had recorded with Freddie Mercury all those years ago, Bowie's voice soared with such raw power that it felt like he was summoning every ounce of strength he had ever possessed. The crowd went wild, but when the song ended and the applause washed over him, Bowie stood perfectly still, tears visible on his cheeks under the stage lights. The set list moved toward its conclusion. Changes, Ziggy Stardust, Suffragette City, all the anthems that had defined generations. And then came the final song, the one that nobody expected, but somehow made perfect sense. Lazarus. It was a track from his musical project that was still in development, something most of the audience hadn't heard yet. The lyrics took on a haunting quality in that space, Bowie singing about being in heaven, about having nothing left to lose, about looking up from somewhere below. The band played with a tenderness that felt like prayer, every note weighted with unspoken meaning. As the final notes of Lazarus faded into silence, the crowd erupted in applause that shook the walls. Bowie stood center stage, bathed in white light, arms spread wide, accepting the adoration like a benediction. The ovation went on for nearly 3 minutes, people refusing to stop clapping, sensing that something profound had just occurred, even if they couldn't articulate what. And then Bowie did something that nobody, not even his closest collaborators, had ever seen him do in 40 years of performing. He reached down and switched off his microphone. The small click was inaudible to the audience, but the band saw it happen. Bowie then walked to Sterling Campbell first, bent down close to the drummer, and whispered something directly into his ear. Campbell's expression changed instantly, his face draining of color, his eyes going wide. Bowie squeezed his shoulder, held his gaze for a moment that felt eternal, and then moved on. Next was Gerry Leonard, who received his own whispered message and immediately looked like he wanted to drop his guitar and grab Bowie, hold him there, prevent whatever was coming. But Bowie moved on, working his way through each band member, delivering individual messages that nobody else could hear. When he reached Gail Ann Dorsey, she later said that Bowie's eyes were filled with tears. He put both hands on her shoulders, leaned in close, and spoke words that she refused to share with anyone for years. All she would say publicly was that it was the most beautiful and heartbreaking thing anyone had ever said to her. The moment lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but it felt like time had stopped, like the entire universe had contracted down to just the two of them and this impossible goodbye. The audience, unaware of what was happening, continued to cheer and applaud, thinking this was just Bowie being generous and acknowledging his band, something performers do all the time. But anyone watching closely could see this was different. The body language was wrong. The energy was wrong. This wasn't showmanship. This was farewell. Bowie took his final bow, waved to the crowd one last time, and walked off stage. The house lights came up, people filed out into the cold November night, and life continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But backstage, the mood was somber, confused, almost panicked. The band members gathered in the dressing room area, looking at each other with the shared knowledge that something seismic had just occurred. Gerry Leonard tried to find Bowie, to talk to him, to understand what those whispered words had meant, but he was already gone. He had left the venue through a back exit before anyone could catch him. In the days that followed, the band tried to reach out. Phone calls went unreturned. Emails disappeared into the void. It was as if Bowie had vanished from the earth. Weeks turned into months, and still nothing. No announcements about future tours, no new album news, no interviews, no public appearances. For an artist who had been a constant presence in popular culture for decades, the silence was deafening. The music press speculated wildly. Was he sick? Retired? Had he had another health scare? Nobody knew, and those who might have known weren't talking. Sterling Campbell, in a rare interview years later, admitted that the waiting was torture. "We all made a pact not to share what he said to us individually," Campbell explained. "It felt like betraying something sacred. But the not knowing, the wondering if we'd ever see him again, if we'd ever get to play with him one more time, that was agonizing." The drummer revealed that he would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, convinced he had dreamed the whole thing, that November 9th had never really happened. But then he would remember the weight of Bowie's hand on his shoulder, the intensity in those mismatched eyes, the words that had been spoken in confidence, and he would know it had been real. Gail Ann Dorsey took it perhaps the hardest. She had worked with Bowie for over 15 years by that point, had been given the honor of singing Freddie Mercury's parts in Under Pressure during live performances, had been trusted with some of his most intimate musical moments. The sudden silence felt like a death, even though Bowie was still alive and presumably out there somewhere. She threw herself into other projects, played with other artists, but there was always this ghost of that final night haunting her. The whispered words, whatever they had been, had changed her relationship with music itself. As the years rolled by, people started to look back at that 2006 performance with fresh eyes. YouTube videos of the concert were analyzed frame by obsessive fans who sensed there was more to the story than anyone was letting on. They noticed the way Bowie had lingered on certain lyrics, the unusual set-list choices, the emotional intensity that seemed excessive even for him. Some fans created elaborate theories about what had happened backstage, spinning conspiracies that ranged from plausible to absurd. But the truth remained locked away, known only to a handful of people who had sworn themselves to secrecy. What nobody outside that inner circle knew at the time was that Bowie had already begun working on what would become his final album. Blackstar was being conceived in secret, a project so personal and so deliberately enigmatic that he kept it hidden from almost everyone. The themes that would later emerge in that album, the preoccupation with mortality, with legacy, with saying goodbye while still maintaining artistic mystery, those themes were already forming in November 2006, the whispered words to his band, the final performance at the Hammerstein Ballroom. These were the first brushstrokes of a masterpiece that wouldn't be revealed for another decade. Gerry Leonard, who would later work on Blackstar, began to understand in retrospect what that night had been about. Bowie was testing something, working through something, using that final concert as a laboratory for ideas about ending and transformation. The way he had turned off the microphone, rendering himself voiceless to the audience while still communicating intimately with his band, that became a central metaphor in his later work. The artist who had spent his entire career performing for the masses, creating personas and spectacles, was exploring what it meant to communicate person to person, human to human, without the mediation of performance. Then, in 2013, something impossible happened. David Bowie released new music. The next day appeared with almost no warning, no promotional tour, no interviews, nothing but the music itself. The album cover was the Heroes cover with the original image obscured by a white square, as if Bowie was both referencing his past and deliberately blocking it from view. Critics and fans went crazy, analyzing every lyric, every production choice, trying to understand where this had come from after 7 years of silence. But those who had been at the Hammerstein Ballroom in 2006 heard something else in that music. They heard the beginning of an ending. The album dealt explicitly with themes of aging, death, memory, and mortality. Songs like Where Are We Now captured a sense of displacement and nostalgia that felt deeply personal. Bowie was looking back at his life, at Berlin, at his younger self, with the perspective of someone who knew time was running out. But still, he gave no interviews, made no public appearances, remained hidden behind the music. The world got to hear his voice, his thoughts, but never got to see the man himself. It was genius in its own way, this gradual disappearing act, this slow transformation from physical presence to pure artistic essence. Sterling Campbell and the other musicians from that 2006 concert watched all of this from the outside, just like everyone else. Bowie had not reached out to them, had not invited them to work on the next day. They were hurt by this, confused, wondering if they had somehow failed him, if the whispered words that night had been some kind of goodbye to them specifically. But in 2015, everything changed. Bowie began assembling a band for what would become the Blackstar sessions, and he reached out to some of his old collaborators. Not all of them, but enough that a message was being sent. He had not forgotten. When David Bowie died on January 10, 2016, the world stopped. The timing was almost theatrical in its precision, coming just 2 days after the release of Blackstar, an album that was clearly designed as a farewell, even if most people hadn't realized it until it was too late. The music videos, especially for Lazarus, took on new meaning. Bowie in a hospital bed, singing about being free, about looking up from the grave. He had orchestrated his own ending, turned his death into art, maintained control until the very last moment. In the weeks following his death, Sterling Campbell finally broke his silence about that night in 2006. In an interview that went viral, he revealed what Bowie had whispered to him nearly 10 years earlier. He said, "Remember this feeling, because I'm going to disappear now. And when I come back, if I come back, it won't be the same. But I need you to know that tonight, right now, this is real. This is me. Hold on to that." Campbell broke down while saying it, the weight of carrying that message for so long finally lifting. Gerry Leonard shared his own whispered words in a magazine article. Bowie had told him, "You made me brave enough to stop. Thank you for that." Leonard admitted he hadn't understood it at the time, but now it made perfect sense. Bowie had been gathering the courage to step away from the relentless cycle of touring and performing, to retreat into the studio, to spend his final years focused on the art itself rather than the spectacle around it. Gail Ann Dorsey waited the longest to share what Bowie had said to her. It took until 2018, 2 years after his death, before she felt ready. In a podcast interview, she revealed that Bowie had whispered, "You taught me what it means to be present. I'm going to try to do that now. Really be here for what's left. I love you." The simplicity of it, the directness, was so unlike the Bowie that the public knew, the master of artifice and reinvention. But it was exactly like the David Jones that his closest collaborators knew, the man beneath all the personas. So what really happened on November 9th, 2006? The truth, as it has emerged over the years through interviews, articles, and carefully guarded testimonies, is both simpler and more profound than any conspiracy theory could have imagined. Bowie had not been given a terminal diagnosis. He wasn't sick yet, not in any medical sense. But he had come to a realization about his life, about his art, about what he wanted the final chapter to look like. The heart surgery in 2004 had terrified him, not because of the physical pain, but because it had given him a glimpse of his own mortality. For an artist who had spent decades creating and killing off personas, the idea of his actual death, his final and irreversible transformation, was both fascinating and horrifying. He began to think about legacy, about how he would be remembered, about what he still wanted to say. And he realized that he needed to step away from the constant performance of being David Bowie in order to figure out who David Jones actually was. That night at the Hammerstein Ballroom was his conscious farewell to life as a touring musician. He knew he would make more music, knew he had more to say, but he also knew he couldn't keep doing it the old way, the way that required him to be constantly visible, constantly performing, constantly feeding the machine of celebrity. So he made a choice. He would disappear. He would take control of his own narrative by removing himself from the narrative entirely. And he wanted his band, these people who had given him so much, to understand why. The whispered words were different for each person, because Bowie understood that each relationship was unique. Each connection required its own acknowledgement. He wasn't just saying goodbye. He was honoring the specific ways each musician had impacted his life and his art. It was an act of profound respect and love, this individual benediction delivered in the midst of public celebration. The audience saw a rock star thanking his band. The band experienced something infinitely more intimate and irreplaceable. What Bowie did in those years between 2006 and his death was revolutionary in its own quiet way. He rejected the modern celebrity imperative to be constantly visible, constantly available, constantly performing. He chose privacy, family, art over spectacle. He spent time with his wife Iman and his daughter Alexandria in their New York apartment, walked the streets of Soho unrecognized because he wasn't performing Bowie anymore, worked in the studio on music that would only be released when he was ready or when he was gone. The next day in 2013 was a test, a way of seeing if he could still create and release work without having to become public again. The success of that album proved he could. Music could exist without the performance of music. Art could speak for itself without the artist having to explain or promote or defend it. This freed him to work on Blackstar, the final statement, the album that would be released with perfect timing to coincide with his death and serve as both eulogy and triumph. Sterling Campbell said something profound in an interview years after Bowie's death. That night in 2006, we thought we were losing him. But really, he was giving himself permission to finally be himself. Not Ziggy, not the thin white Duke, not Aladdin Sane, just David. And that's what he was for those last 10 years. just David, making the art he wanted to make, living the life he wanted to live, controlling his own ending. We were sad because we missed him, but he was finally free. The mystery of Bowie's last concert isn't really about what he whispered or why he disappeared. It's about the courage it takes to step away when everyone wants you to stay. It's about knowing when the performance has to end so the real work can begin. It's about understanding that legacy isn't built in the bright lights of the stage but in the quiet moments, the choices nobody sees, the conversations that happen with the microphone turned off. Those 3,000 people who were at the Hammerstein Ballroom that night witnessed something they couldn't possibly have understood in the moment. They saw the end of one version of David Bowie and didn't even know it. They watched a man say goodbye to a life he had lived for 40 years, a life of constant touring, constant performing, constant transformation. And they had no idea that in that goodbye was also a hello, the beginning of the final phase, the last and greatest reinvention. The band members who received those whispered words carried them like sacred texts, refusing to share them until after Bowie was gone, and it felt safe, appropriate, honorable to reveal them. Even then, they did so reluctantly, understanding that some mysteries should remain mysteries, that some intimacy should be protected from public consumption. But they also understood that people needed to know, needed to understand what that night had meant, needed to see that even the greatest artists are ultimately human beings dealing with the same questions we all face. How do we say goodbye? How do we choose what matters? How do we maintain dignity and control when everything is designed to strip those things away? David Bowie's answer was to turn off the microphone, walk to each person who mattered, and speak words that were just for them. No audience, no recording, no performance. Just human connection, direct and unfiltered and real. In a career defined by artifice and spectacle, that might have been his most authentic act. And it happened on November 9th, 2006, at a concert that 3,000 people attended and nobody truly understood until it was too late. The mystery isn't solved by knowing what he whispered. The mystery deepens, because now we understand that David Bowie spent the last 10 years of his life living according to those whispered truths, whatever they were, finding the courage to be invisible, creating art without self-promotion, loving without spectacle, dying with grace and intention. That final concert was the beginning of the most radical transformation of all, the shedding of Bowie himself to reveal the man underneath. When Sterling Campbell sat behind his drum kit that night, he thought he was just playing another gig with an old friend. He had no idea he was participating in a ritual of ending, a ceremony of transformation, a moment that would define the rest of his life. None of them did. That's the real mystery, the one that lingers even now. How many moments are we living through without realizing their significance? How many goodbyes do we miss because they look like ordinary days? David Bowie knew that November 9th, 2006 was special, that it marked a turning point, that nothing would be the same after. He made sure the people who mattered knew it too, even if they couldn't fully understand it yet. And then he did what he always did best. He transformed, disappeared, became something else entirely. The man on stage at the Hammerstein Ballroom was David Bowie saying goodbye. The man who walked out the back door was David Jones, finally free to live the life he chose. That's what he whispered. Freedom, love, gratitude, farewell. And, underneath all of it, the simple human truth that we all struggle with. This matters. You matter. I was here. Remember me not as the characters I played, but as the person I was in this moment, with the microphone off, just us, just real, just true. The band remembered. The world remembers. And somewhere, perhaps, David Jones is smiling at the beautiful mystery he left behind. The final performance that wasn't a performance at all.